Kenneth Bunting is the executive director of the National Freedom of Information Coalition, a nonpartisan alliance of citizen-driven nonprofit freedom of information organizations protecting Americans' rights to open government. During his 12-year tenure as ranking editor for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, he won more national and regional awards for journalistic excellence than at any other time in its 146-year history. Kenneth was among 5 inaugural inductees into the Journalism Hall of Excellence at Texas Christian University. He has contributed to 2 books, The Passionate Editor and An Ethics Trajectory, Visions of Media Past, Present, and Yet to Come. He lives in Columbia, Missouri with his wife, a former broadcast journalist. Let's welcome our first panelist, Kenneth Bunting. Welcome to the Global Freedom Report. Kenneth, are you there? Kenneth, are you there? You need to take off the muting on your microphone, Kenneth. Ken.
Hi.
There you go. Hi there. How are you?
I'm fine.
All right.
Good to be with you.
Okay. It seems as if the Internet has, if anything, diminished the quality of modern journalism. There are no more Walter Cronkites or Edward R. Murrows.
I'd say that's true and in more ways than one.
Well, I'm curious, as an award-winning journalist of note, because I make these comments all the time, but who am I? But, you won a lot of awards. You've got credibility. Would you offer a general characterization of today's reporters and correspondents, just briefly?
No, I think we've got a lot of talent in the journalism field, but the field has changed. The landscape has changed. Back in the days of Walter Cronkite and Ben Bradley, every medium had a news cycle, and the news cycle was very well defined, and usually it was on a 24-hour clock. And between one edition and the next, there was a great effort on the part of the journalists to improve every single part of their report, to add developments, to double-check and triple-check, to make sure everything was correct. Nowadays, the 24-hour news cycle has changed that tremendously so that the pressure is to do it first, do it fast, not so much do it right. Many journalists think that the Internet or digital journalism is a self-correcting mechanism. And so maybe the standards have changed, but that's because of the medium.
All right, thank you. Our next panelist, Mike Brown, is a ghostwriter for attorneys in New York and Miami. Mike's the guy they call else can figure out how to deal with the case. And the senior paralegal for the Joseph Lacombe law firm of Springfield, Missouri. You guys are kind of neighbors. Mike's specialty is breaking indictments. If an indictment is faulty, goes the prosecution. For example, quite often prosecutors add on bogus charges in order to terrorize an accused into agreeing to a plea bargain. Mike goes after such legal tricksters. He is often known as America's Judge Buster. Mike has worked in the legal field for 37 years. He's the author of several books on the legal system, including the brilliant volume, The Criminal Defendant's Bible. In his latest book, Defending a Drug Case, Mike shows how to go outside the legal system to win your case. Let's welcome our second panelist, Mike Brown. Welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Thanks for having me, Brent.
It's a pleasure. Mike, what does it mean to be a ghostwriter for attorneys?
It means that I write it, the attorney submits it, and he takes credit for it. I'm a ghost.
Oh, boy. I don't know. There's something about that. He takes credit for it part is the part that I don't quite love.
Long as they pay me, I don't care who takes the credit for it.
Well, now that's very good. Mike, in about 20 seconds, how has the landscape in the last 10, 15 years changed around all the issues that you deal with?
Actually, it started changing in 1989 because, as close as I can determine, there was a directive put out by George Bush Sr. to all the federal judges to just ignore these pesky little nitpicking legal details like the Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution and all that, because there were too many people getting away on technicalities. I guess that's what they call constitutional guarantees. And, for example, prior to 1989, I used to win 90% of my cases in the Court of Appeals. No, it's about like 1 in 3. And basically, I'll tell a client from the beginning if I'm ghostwriting for him.
By the way, Mike is one of the best. If he only gets 1 in 3, anybody else will get 1 in 15. Let me introduce our third panelist. Carolyn Roth has been a longtime activist supporting human rights and limited government. In 2010, she started Oregon Citizens for Police Accountability, which seeks to provide people with a platform to speak out against police misconduct and violence as a response to an account of police brutality in her local area. Carolyn is a Los Angeles native. She has lived in Oregon for the last 10 years. She attended a small private college in Virginia where she majored in English. Let's welcome our third panelist, Carolyn Roth. Welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Thanks for having me on the show, Brent.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Carolyn. You established a police accountability group in response to an account of police brutality in your area. Very briefly, what happened? What was the incident that inspired you to activism?
Well, we essentially have a kind of rogue ranger, a BLM ranger acting outside of the law, who assaulted an entire family over an ATV sticker. And unfortunately, the case was adjudicated and he was found to have no wrongdoing, but we did actually attempt to start a petition to have him removed. And, you know, we have a lot of other instances in our local area, for example, a southern...
But that was the one that kind of sparked the flame, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah, and, you know, that's interesting because, see, government doesn't know when to stop, so it squeezes tighter and tighter, which means sooner or later it pushes everybody too far, and then they push back. Just about every one of you listening to my voice has at some point experienced frustration at the excesses of and violations committed by government officials. Almost always, like Carolyn said, with impunity, meaning when a police officer, a judge, or elected or appointed official breaks the law, there are seldom, if ever, any serious consequences. Why are our public servants not held accountable? And is there anything we can do about it? That is the topic. That is the subject of today's panel. My first question, I'd like to start with you, Mike Brown. U.S. courts have consistently ruled that government officials are immune from prosecution for any violations they commit in the course of their official duties. What's the reason for providing such immunity to government officials? And is it an appropriate exemption to offer public employees in a free society?
Well, Brent, in the first place, if they're acting in their official capacity, yeah, they've got immunity and all that sort of thing. However, the rule is that, and like the lady here was describing, if somebody gets out of line, in other words, if they do the Rodney King routine on your head, that's not part of his official duties. He's supposed to be held accountable for that. The problem is the very people who are supposed to be administering the system are the ones who are literally committing more crimes than anyone. And I'm talking about judges. And for whatever it's worth, I've scraped 3 federal judges off the bench in the last 20 years, and I still have about 800 to go, and I don't know if I'm going to get it done or not. But in fact, the Carolyn Roth here, what she's saying is, and I don't know which court this was adjudicated in. If it was adjudicated in state court, well, that would explain why it didn't work. If it was adjudicated in federal court under Title 42, United States Code, Section 1983, that's what you're supposed to use to get state actors who are getting out of line, violating your constitutional rights, and so forth. But the problem is the courts have created so many doctrines of their own. In other words, the courts have legislated so much that, I mean, you literally, anytime you get involved in a case these days, whether it's federal or state, civil or criminal, and those are the only 4 types of cases that there are, you have this literal minefield that you have to navigate your way through just to try to get your grievance put in front of a jury. And it didn't used to be like that. It just gets worse every year.
Well, thank you. Kenneth, okay, along the same lines, what's the reason for giving these people immunity in the first place? And is such immunity, under any circumstances, appropriate for public officials in a free society?
Well, I've gotten in trouble with prosecutorial groups, and I get in trouble daily with bureaucrats throughout the on open government issues, feeling that those who intentionally violate disclosure laws ought to have some culpability of their own and not just the taxpayers' money. But back to police accountability, I think there's a trend going around the country that you guys should all be aware of. Certainly, Carolyn, there are a number of states that have recently passed statutes that say if you take your camera phone and film a policeman in the course of his official duties, you are violating a state statute. And there have been prosecutions on this. One in Illinois that is notable. There's also been a recent federal case, good federal case in the First District, in which the First District looked at one of those laws, and I don't know the facts of the suit, but basically said what we all should be screaming out loud, that it's unconstitutional against our First Amendment rights to say that you can't stand in a public place and take out your phone and film an officer, particularly when he's in the midst of wrongdoing or abusing a citizen. But that First Amendment, that First District ruling on the First Amendment that held the law is not just a little unconstitutional but crazy, may not help a Chicago man who I think is still facing a sentence of up to 70 years because he violated that. I'm putting quotes around this word with my fingers that you guys can't see, but violated this law that said he was not within his rights to film an officer who was abusing another citizen.
Yeah, and that was actually 75 years. The judge threw it out. Now the prosecutor wants to appeal the judge's decision, and they want to push for this guy to be put in prison for 75 years for recording and filming a cop in the line of duty. Absolutely right. Carolyn, how about you? Do you believe an immunity exemption for public employees is appropriate in a free society?
I mean, it essentially encourages wrongdoing. I think that it's absolutely inappropriate. It's saying if you go against the law, then that's just fine. I mean, I believe that it actually encourages it.
Now, I don't know if what I'm about to say is even true or not, so I'm going to look to the three of you to help me know whether I'm being naive or not. But it seems to me that unions play some kind of part in the non-accountability, in the inability to hold government officials accountable. It seems like I know of stories where teachers who've been incompetent have not been fired because the union rules don't allow it. We have police unions, we have political unions, we have government unions. I don't know, do we have judges unions? I don't even know that. But Kenneth, let's start with you on this. Do unions influence efforts to hold government employees accountable for their excesses, or am I imagining it?
No, I mean, certainly police unions are involved in circling the wagons and coming to the defense of police officers who are accused of wrongdoing. And if that means fighting against disclosure of information, they have been on the wrong side of that issue. I think there's the same thing is true of some teachers unions across the country in cases involving disciplinary reports. Now, I don't think unions are the whole problem. I think the culture of non-disclosure among public officials, particularly in law enforcement, but in all areas, is a bigger problem than unions. But yes, for individual cases where a police officers reports about their misconduct, unions are usually on the side of keeping those from being disclosed.
Carolyn, would you agree with that police unions tend to make it harder, not necessarily, again, the be-all, end-all, the only factor, but that they make it more difficult to go after police who have in some way violated their oaths?
I think so. I think that it, having the unionization can be positive in certain aspects, but obviously they do protect their own. Having non-disclosure, it just makes it difficult to hold people accountable. And I think that I can fully agree with Kenneth on that.
Now, are there judges' unions out there, Mike? I mean, I don't recall hearing about them, but I would find it kind of difficult to believe that the judges would not take advantage of the things the politicians and the police might take advantage of in that respect.
Well, if there is such an animal, I've never encountered it. most judges, I mean, why would they need a union? They've got carte blanche to trample the rights of the rest of us. And there's judicial independence. There's judicial immunity. I mean, you're dealing with one group of the population that basically a union would be kind of superfluous.
So we don't need no stinking union, huh? Yeah, go ahead. What were you saying, Ken?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not aware of any judges' unions, but there are judicial councils in various states and also a federal judicial council that has some role in holding judges accountable and also acting on their misconduct when it occurs. But one of the funny things you might look at and explore is that across the country, where there are judicial councils that cover judges in state courts, it covers judges in state courts all the way up to that state's Supreme Court, which is the final arbiter in the judicial council, so they can punish a judge beneath their level, but they themselves are not subject to the same judicial council that looks at other judges. And that's bad public policy from my viewpoint.
Mike, would you concur with that on the judicial councils and whether or not they're functioning the way they're supposed to?
Well, I've never run into a judicial council that did function the way it was supposed to. For example, the federal courts, there's a statute, Title 28, United States Code, Section 351, complaint for judicial misconduct. Federal government will get hit with about 1,000 of them a year. Probably should be 10 times that number. If you're lucky, they'll do something in one of them. I mean, basically, judges will protect their own. Men are more often bribed by their loyalties and ambitions than they are by money. So when you go up against one federal judge, you're going to have problems with all of them. Now, police, on the other hand, they're easier to deal with because they're like sharks and bluefish. You create enough heat on a cop, and the other ones they'll throw him overboard. And I'm speaking from experience here.
Oh, no, that's interesting because I always thought of that. I would always think of the police as, watching, like you say, the judges are protecting each other, the police are protecting each other, the politicians are protecting each other. And so that's interesting that you would say that. And maybe there's some strategy in that. I don't know.
It's encouraging to hear Michael say that. I also thought that the code of silence came into play more often than officers having the courage to speak up against their fellow officers.
Now, gentlemen, let me, and the lady here, let me define a cop for you, okay? And I know this is going to sound politically incorrect, but the definition of a cop...
be politically incorrect on this.
Okay. Is somebody who's too lazy to work and too yellow to steal.
May I quote you on that, Mr. Brown?
Yes, you may. Yes, you may.
So I laughed, but I didn't necessarily concur.
Kenneth, let me ask you this. This is something that has bothered me for a long time. When a political figure such as Barack Obama stands in front of television cameras and makes promises to millions and millions and millions of people, promises that are intended to influence them to vote for him or her, when that person is elected and then reneges on his or her promises, why can't we prosecute that political liar for fraud? If I did that to you, I could go to jail for fraud.
You'd have to ask the U.S. Attorney. I'm going to be on a panel with Ken Starr in a couple of weeks. Maybe I'll ask Ken the question and see if he thinks there's a way to stretch it. I think politicians ought to be held accountable for the promises they make. Every politician known to mankind, from far right to far left, promises they're going to conduct themselves in a way that's open and transparent, but it doesn't always translate once the lip service is over into their actual practice. I point out in speeches sometimes that on his first day in office, President Obama promised that his was going to be the most transparent government in history, and on Speaker Boehner's first day as Speaker, he promised that he was going to make it the most transparent Congress in history. Now, a few seconds later, Speaker Boehner said, but I didn't say every bill would be open. But my point is, there are two guys who, from at distant ends of the political spectrum, who sometimes go on TV and say they'd like to find some common ground to agree on. Well, I've got one for them. Why don't you guys get together and keep your promises with transparency? That would be a great one for all of us.
Well, let me go to Mike on this. Mike, this, like I said, this bothers me. The definition of fraud legally is to do something or say something designed to induce other party or parties to either do something they ordinarily would not do or to not do something they ordinarily would do. Okay? And it's, that's what politicians do all the time. So why can't we go after them for fraud? Free speech doesn't cover fraud, I don't think.
No, it doesn't, but fraud has three elements. First, somebody has to say something. Second, you have to act on it. Third, you have to show damages. Well, the damages are too attenuated because, as Jim Hightower once said, sure, maybe the guy lied and you elected him instead of the next guy, but let's face it, people, like Jim Hightower said, if God had wanted us to vote, he would have given us candidates.
No, but wait a moment. Now, hang on a second there. Okay, because that's not fair. Because you look at the country. I mean, talk about damages. We've got the class action lawsuit to end all class actions. 300 million people who've been damaged by this fraud.
Yeah, well, the problem is, Brent, that's like God telling the devil, I'm going to sue you, and the devil looks at him and smiles and says, oh, really? Where are you going to get a lawyer?
Well, and again, that's the catch-22. We end up in that catch-22.
Okay, let me say something here, Brent.
Please. Because
this is about to become a self-solving problem, all right? Here's what everybody has missed. And I figured this out about 10 years ago, and I've seen election after election decided because of this. The largest voting bloc in the United States is now the families and friends of the convicted. And the families and friends of the convicted, I know you mentioned, your question of the day is these mandatory minimums. They're an absolute disaster, which I don't think we have time to discuss why right at the moment. But the families and friends of the convicted, when they realize, you'll have to forgive the phone going off in the background, I can't get to it, throw it in the trash. But what you have to understand is that when those people understand that all they have to do if they want to change the laws is to change the lawmakers, and you're going to see when that group figures out that A, they're the largest voting bloc, and B, they need to throw the bums out, you're going to see this whole country go upside down.
So how do we get them to figure it out? I mean, there's the question of the day.
My new book is part of it because the guy on the cover, and I believe you have a copy of it, has 1 million followers. And he's getting the word out. And at some point, I don't know when this is going to happen or how it's going to happen, but at some point when the families and friends of the convicted realize they're the largest voting bloc, and even though they haven't realized it, they have literally affected election after election. Gray Davis in California, over a dozen years ago, he thought it was the Funny Time Charlies that put him in office. But it wasn't. It was the prisoners. Because his opponent, Dan Lundgren, author of the 3 Strikes Law, you get, 50 years for stealing a batch of cookies the third time. The prisoners, and I was in contact with these guys because this is the element that I work with, the prisoners were writing and calling their friends and family on the street and saying, whatever you do, register to vote, because if this guy Lundgren gets in, we will never get out. That's how Gray Davis won that election. There's been election after election decided like that. But the people who decided it don't understand how much power they've got. When they do, and when they realize the only way they can use it, which is throw the bums out, it's only going to take an election or two for these House of Representatives to turn over federal and state. And at some point, somebody's going to say, wait a minute here, I don't want to be reading the help wanted ads after the next election. Maybe I better do something to clean this mess up. And for a member of a state or federal House of Representatives, it's a piece of cake. It's just you can't get any of them off their butts. And some of them that, their instincts are good. The lights are on, but nobody's home.
That raises a question because you talk about these federal representatives and such. I have found personally that the state representatives tend to be a little bit more responsive. Carolyn, when you've run into the situations that you've encountered around the police abuse and police excesses and police violations of citizens, have you had occasion to interact with your political officials in the state? And have they been able to shed any kind of light on solutions to the problem, or have they done like what Mike suggests, which is like the feds, which is basically obstruct, and ignore? And say, somebody out there, there's a legal firm there, obstruct, and ignore.
Essentially, you can contact your representatives, you can contact, your more local government, and they kind of give you a cookie-cutter response. Sometimes you can tell that it's something that they send to literally everybody who has a complaint. They don't really have answers. They really have just, an automatically generated response to these things because they see it so frequently, and there are so many complaints that they've found that they can just literally not address them.
So are you basically saying you don't feel like you've been able to get anywhere using state representations?
Absolutely not.
Boy, it's like, it's a wonder that the American people have been patient this long with this kind of abuse. It's our monthly roundtable event, folks. If you'd like to join in, if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to, shed some light on any of this stuff that we're discussing, give us a call toll free, 888-747-1968, 888-747-1968. This is our monthly roundtable event, our panel discussion, and the topic is government accountability. It's a discussion of how government officials around the world, especially in the U.S., are seldom, if ever, held accountable for their actions, even when they commit outright violations of the law. If you'd like to join in, the toll-free number is 888-747-1968. That number again, 888-747-1968. You can also join us in our live chat room at www.globalfreedomreport.com. Our three panelists are Mike Brown with the Joseph Lacombe Law Firm of Springfield, Missouri, commonly known as America's Judge Buster. As he said in hour one, he has scraped 3 federal judges off the bench, and I think it's an apt description. Award-winning journalist and executive director of the National Freedom of Information Coalition, Kenneth F. Bunting, and Carolyn Roth of Oregon Citizens for Police Accountability. Those are our 3 panelists. We have a caller on the line. Craig is calling in from, is that Kentucky? I think so. Craig, welcome to the show. You're on the air.
Thank you, Brent. This show absolutely summarizes the problem, and in my opinion, I'd like to state it: the Constitution's not being followed, Brent. That's the problem. That's the whole problem that we face. There's no way that we have any rights in this country as an individual unless we follow the Constitution. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And the first 10 amendments, there's no way you can go into court if you can't exercise those first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Now, I'm no expert, but I found that out lately.
Would anyone care to comment on that? That the issue is simply the Constitution is not being followed? Is it? We all know that's true, but is it as simple as that?
You want me to comment, Brent?
Whichever of you wants to jump in.
Okay. Well, let me lead off here. Your rights are only as good or as effective as the people who are to administer and enforce them. And the fact is, the average judge today, federal or state, half of them have substance abuse problems. Probably a quarter of them are sociopaths. So, basically, our ancestors built us a guided missile cruiser, and the politicians with these judges sort of stuffed it with chimpanzees.